The blue glow of the screen flickered in the dimly lit room as a young girl, wrapped in a threadbare hoodie, hesitated before clicking next. Across the world, a billionaire sat in a high-rise penthouse, unaware that one click would change everything. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of an old, overheating laptop. The blue glow of the screen illuminated a pale face, gaunt from exhaustion, eyes weary from years of struggle. Sienna, barely 19, sat curled in a thin blanket, fingers trembling over the touchpad as she scrolled aimlessly through strangers' faces on Omegle. Her world was a box, 4 cracked walls in a crumbling apartment complex, where the flickering ceiling light threatened to go out completely. The only thing that kept her company was the distant sound of sirens and the muffled shouting of the couple next door. It had been weeks since she last ate a proper meal, and the growl of her stomach had become a constant, dull ache, a familiar companion in the hollow of her nights. But tonight, the hunger wasn't what bothered her. It was the weight of loneliness. She pulled her blanket tighter, staring at the screen, watching as one stranger after another clicked away. People laughing, groups of friends huddled in front of webcams, careless and happy in a way she hadn't been in years. Her mother's absence was a wound that had never healed, only scabbed over. 5 years had passed since she left, yet the echoes of her voice still lingered in the apartment. Sienna's fingers brushed over an old silver locket that hung from her neck, a locket that had once belonged to her mother. She had left it behind the night she disappeared, promising she'd return. But she never did. The chain was rusted now, the edges dented from where Sienna had clutched it too tightly during restless nights. It was the only thing she had left of her. A promise turned into a relic of betrayal. Her hand tightened around the locket as she exhaled shakily. What was the point of hoping anymore? She hovered over the next button, hesitating. Maybe she'd find someone to talk to. Someone who wouldn't leave. With a deep breath, she clicked. Across the world, in a penthouse that towered above the city skyline, Alexander Carter swirled the amber liquid in his glass, staring out at the world below. A millionaire at 28, but a prisoner in his own life. He had spent the last decade building an empire, yet he had nothing to show for it except hollow victories and a bank account large enough to buy happiness, if only happiness could be bought. His reflection in the glass doors mocked him. Tailored suit, sharp jawline, every inch of him curated for success. But the eyes told the truth. Dead. He turned away from the city lights and collapsed onto the leather couch, exhaling a breath that felt heavier than usual. His assistant had suggested this. Go on, Omegle, talk to real people. Maybe it'll remind you what life is actually about. It sounded ridiculous. He wasn't desperate. He wasn't lonely. Was he? He took another sip of whiskey, his mind drifting back to the past, the one thing his money could never erase. A name clawed at his thoughts. Eleanor, his mother. The woman who walked away when he was 15, leaving nothing behind but a single handwritten letter and a gold ring on his father's nightstand. He had spent years wondering why. Why wasn't he enough? Why did some people leave so easily, while others spent their lives chasing after ghosts? Alexander shut his eyes for a moment, pressing his fingers against his temples as if he could silence the memories. But they were always there, waiting. His penthouse was filled with every luxury imaginable, yet the silence was deafening. The emptiness stretched across the pristine floors and echoed in the marble halls. He had built walls of glass and steel, but they had only kept the world out. He reached for his laptop. One click, one connection. That's all it took for the past to resurface. Sienna shifted in her chair, the weight of exhaustion pressing against her. She shouldn't be here. She should be applying for jobs, finishing school, if she could even afford to go back. But the truth was, no matter how much she fought, she was stuck in a cycle she couldn't break. Her fingers absent-mindedly traced the locket as the screen refreshed. She had lost count of how many times she had hit next, her hope diminishing with every new face that came and went. Then, the screen settled. At first, it didn't seem real. The space in front of her was too pristine, too polished. A modern penthouse, walls of glass reflecting city lights, the soft glow of golden lamps casting shadows over a man who looked out of place in his own world. He was young, late 20s maybe, but his eyes held the weight of someone much older. Sharp suit, whiskey glass in hand, but there was something in his gaze that betrayed him. He wasn't as put together as he seemed. Their eyes met through the screen. The moment stretched, heavy and uncertain. Sienna had spent years being invisible to the world, but for the first time in a long time, she felt seen. The silence stretched between them, thick with uncertainty. Sienna felt the weight of his stare, the kind that seemed to look through her rather than at her. She had seen people like him before, polished, expensive, untouchable, people who walked past her on the street without a second glance. Yet, for some reason, he hadn't clicked away. Alexander set his glass down, the quiet clink echoing through his penthouse. He leaned back slightly, studying her as if trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't quite fit. She wasn't like the others he had seen tonight. She didn't laugh mindlessly, didn't pose for attention. Instead, there was something about her that pulled at him, a quiet kind of pain buried beneath layers of exhaustion. Long night? His voice was smoother than she expected, with the kind of practiced ease that came from years of speaking in boardrooms and shaking hands with people who mattered. Sienna hesitated. She wasn't sure why, but his question unsettled her. Maybe because it wasn't shallow small talk. It carried weight, like he already knew the answer. Something like that, she murmured, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Alexander nodded slowly, fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. He had no reason to stay. This was just another meaningless interaction in a sea of faces. And yet, something in her eyes made him pause. It was the same thing he saw when he looked in the mirror: loss. Before he could stop himself, he spoke again. "You look like you have a lot on your mind." Sienna let out a soft laugh, the sound hollow. "You could say that." For a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt awkward. It was the kind that held unspoken stories, the kind that stretched between strangers who knew nothing about each other and yet somehow understood. Sienna's fingers brushed against the locket at her throat. She had spent years keeping people at a distance. There was no point in opening up, not when everyone left in the end. But for some reason, tonight felt different. Sienna let out a slow breath, the cold metal of her locket pressing against her palm. There was no reason to answer him. He was just another passing stranger, someone she would never see again after this conversation ended. And yet, something about his presence unsettled her. Not in the way that made her feel unsafe, but in a way that made her feel noticed. That was rare. Her whole life had been a series of being overlooked, by teachers, by distant relatives, by the very people who were supposed to care. She had learned to blend into the background, to exist quietly, unnoticed. But now, there was a man on the other side of the screen who actually seemed to see her. She released the locket and met his gaze. "And what about you?" she asked, shifting the attention back onto him. "Why are you here?" Alexander smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Curiosity, I guess." It was a half-truth. He wasn't sure why he had stayed on this call, why he hadn't clicked away like he had done 100 times before tonight. Maybe it was the way she sat, tense, like she was waiting for the world to collapse around her. Maybe it was the way her voice carried the weight of something unsaid. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking at someone who wanted something from him. Sienna tilted her head slightly. "Curiosity?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "People are predictable. You talk to enough of them, and it all starts sounding the same. But then there's someone different. Someone who isn't just filling the silence for the sake of it." Sienna's fingers curled around the frayed edge of her blanket. There it was again, that feeling of being seen, like he was pulling apart the layers she had carefully built around herself. A part of her wanted to end the conversation before it went any further. The more someone saw, the easier it was for them to hurt you. But another part of her, a part that was tired of holding everything in, whispered, "Maybe, just this once, you don't have to disappear." She shifted slightly, hesitating before she spoke again. "And what do you think I am?" Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His gaze was steady, unreadable. "I think you're running from something." Sienna's breath caught in her throat. He was too close to the truth. She swallowed, trying to ignore the way her heart pounded against her ribs. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "What are you running from?" Alexander's smirk faded, replaced by something unreadable. He didn't answer right away, because the truth was, he didn't know anymore. The weight of the question lingered between them, stretching into the silence. Sienna hadn't expected an answer. People like him, rich, untouchable, perfectly curated for the world, weren't the kind to spill their wounds to strangers. And yet, Alexander's expression shifted, something unspoken, tightening his jaw. Sienna noticed the subtle way his fingers curled slightly, the way his gaze drifted past her, as if he was staring into a past only he could see. Maybe he was running too. Finally, he spoke. "I don't think I'm running." He exhaled a quiet breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "I think I've already run too far. And now, I don't know how to go back." His words caught her off guard. She wasn't sure what she had expected, maybe something flippant, a quick deflection. But there was something in his voice that felt real. Sienna tightened her grip on the frayed blanket draped over her shoulders. She wasn't sure why, but she suddenly wanted to ask him more, to pick apart the carefully built walls around him, just as he had unknowingly begun to do with her. But she didn't, because she knew what happened when you got too close. Instead, she gave a small nod, as if she understood, because in a way she did. The sound of distant sirens outside her window pulled her back to reality. This was stupid. She was talking to a stranger, a man who could log off at any moment and return to his perfect world, while she would still be here, stuck in hers. She wasn't supposed to let herself care. She wasn't supposed to let anyone in. Sienna cleared her throat, pushing the thoughts away. "So, what do millionaires do for fun, besides scrolling through strangers online?" Alexander let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "You make it sound so pathetic." "Isn't it?" She raised an eyebrow. He smirked. "Touché." For a moment, the tension between them lifted, replaced by something lighter. But then, Sienna's laptop screen dimmed. Her heart stuttered. She cursed under her breath, scrambling for the charger she had shoved beneath her pillow earlier. "Not now." Alexander frowned. "Something wrong?" Sienna forced a tight smile. "No, just hold on." She plugged in the charger, pressing the cord into the port a little harder than necessary. The laptop screen flickered back to life. Relief washed over her, but Alexander was still watching her. His gaze flickered across the room behind her. The peeling paint, the broken ceiling light, the way her blanket was wrapped tightly around her as if it was the only source of warmth she had. Sienna stiffened. She wasn't sure why, but suddenly, she hated that he had seen any of it. Hated that, for even a second, he might feel pity. "I should go," she blurted, more forcefully than she intended. Alexander tilted his head slightly, but he didn't argue. He just studied her, the smirk he had worn earlier completely gone. "All right." Sienna hesitated. For a split second, she considered staying. Considered letting the conversation go just a little longer. But she didn't. Because people like him didn't stick around, and she had already learned, the hard way, what happened when they left. She swallowed and clicked off. The screen went black. The reflection of her own tired eyes stared back at her, the dim glow of her laptop casting long shadows across the cracked walls. She had done the right thing. That's what she told herself. Sienna exhaled slowly, forcing her hands to steady as she closed the laptop, the old hinges creaking slightly. It was better this way. No attachments, no false hope. She pulled her blanket tighter, curling into herself as the weight of exhaustion pressed down on her. She had spent so long learning how to be alone, how to survive in a world that had never made space for her. So why did she feel like she had just lost something? She shook her head, pushing the thought away. It didn't matter. It wasn't like he was going to come back. But Alexander did. Hours passed, but he couldn't shake the strange pull in his chest, the nagging curiosity that wouldn't let go. He had met thousands of people in his life, business executives, politicians, celebrities, but none of them had ever made him pause like she did. And the look in her eyes before she left, it had reminded him of himself. Alexander leaned forward, fingers hovering over the keyboard. What was he even doing? This wasn't like him. He didn't chase things. He didn't dwell on meaningless conversations. And yet, a few keystrokes, a flick of his wrist, he navigated through the same platform, searching. Searching for what? He wasn't sure. But then, a familiar face appeared on the screen. She was still there. Sienna blinked in surprise, her breath catching in her throat as the screen refreshed. Number, it wasn't possible. She had closed the laptop. She had ended the conversation. But somehow, against all logic, he was back. Their eyes met, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Hope. And that terrified her. Sienna's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her mind racing. Why was he back? People didn't return. Not to her. Not ever. Her instinct was to shut the laptop, to sever the connection before it could become something real. But something about the way he was looking at her, calm, steady, like he had made a choice to be here, stopped her. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to sound indifferent. Lost again? A small smirk played on Alexander's lips, but it was softer this time, without the usual edge. Maybe. Or maybe I was looking for someone. Sienna's breath hitched slightly. She didn't like the way those words made her feel. He was just a stranger, a rich, untouchable stranger who could go back to his perfect life at any moment. She shouldn't let herself believe he cared. She tilted her head, studying him. Why? Alexander leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Because I don't think our conversation was finished. A humorless chuckle escaped her. People like you don't chase conversations. His eyes darkened slightly. People like me? Sienna shrugged, fingers tightening around the frayed edge of her blanket. Rich. Put together. You could talk to anyone. But you're here. Alexander didn't flinch. So are you. She clenched her jaw. He wasn't supposed to turn it back on her. Sienna let out a quiet breath, trying to ignore the way her pulse had picked up. I don't think you know what you're looking for. Alexander's gaze flickered toward the locket around her neck, the way her fingers brushed over it absent-mindedly, like she was tethering herself to something long gone. I think you do, he said. Sienna froze, and for the first time she had no idea what to say. Sienna's fingers curled around the locket, her pulse quickening. He wasn't supposed to notice. Most people overlooked the small silver pendant, dismissing it as just another piece of cheap jewelry. But Alexander saw it. And worse, he had recognized its significance. She forced her hand to relax, dropping the locket against her chest. You think you know me? She asked, her voice quieter now. Alexander tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. Number. But I think I know what it's like to hold on to something that keeps you from falling apart. Her breath caught. How did he see so much when she had barely said anything? Sienna shifted in her chair, suddenly uncomfortable. This wasn't supposed to happen. Conversations with strangers were supposed to be fleeting, surface level, safe. They weren't supposed to feel like this, like someone reaching into her carefully built walls and exposing the cracks beneath. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Why are you still here? Alexander leaned back in his chair, considering her question. Why was he still here? He had spent years perfecting the art of detachment, avoiding connections that could complicate his life. And yet, here he was, talking to a girl whose world looked nothing like his. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper, something unspoken that he wasn't ready to name yet. Finally, he spoke. "Because I don't think you want me to leave." Sienna's heart pounded. He was wrong. He had to be. But the worst part was, she wasn't sure if he was. The days passed, but the conversation never really ended. Sienna had told herself that night was a fluke, just another stranger on the internet. But somehow Alexander kept coming back, and she let him. It became routine. Late nights, quiet conversations. Her laptop screen became a window into a world so different from her own, a world of sleek offices, expensive whiskey, and power she could never imagine holding. And yet, despite the differences, there was something achingly familiar about him. He understood loneliness, not the kind that came from being alone, but the kind that came from being surrounded by people and still feeling invisible. But the more time they spent together, the more Sienna felt something shift. This wasn't just distraction anymore. It was dangerous. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was hoping. And hope was the most dangerous thing of all. One night, Alexander didn't show up. Sienna waited longer than she wanted to admit, her fingers tapping against the laptop's edge, her stomach tightening with something she refused to name. She wasn't supposed to care. And yet, she did. Hours passed. The screen remained empty. And then, finally, his name appeared. But something was wrong. His usual confidence was gone. His suit was disheveled, the top buttons undone. His hand raked through his hair as he let out a sharp breath. There was something in his eyes she had never seen before. Defeat. "What happened?" she asked before she could stop herself. Alexander let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "What always happens?" Sienna frowned. "And what's that?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His jaw tightened. "I trusted the wrong people." Her chest tightened. She had seen that look before. It was the same one she had worn when her mother walked out the door and never came back. Sienna swallowed, pushing past the sudden lump in her throat. What did they do? Alexander exhaled slowly. For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, finally, he spoke. "They took everything." Sienna's fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to say. "Everything?" Alexander let out a slow, bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "It's funny, isn't it?" he muttered. "You spend your whole life building something, thinking you have control. And then, in a matter of hours, it's gone." His voice was steady, but Sienna could hear what he wasn't saying, the exhaustion, the betrayal, the weight of losing something that wasn't just about money. She knew that weight. She knew what it was like to have the ground ripped out from beneath her, to wake up one morning and realize the life you thought you had was never really yours to keep. Sienna swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Who?" Alexander exhaled sharply. "Business partners, people I thought I could trust." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "Turns out loyalty is just another currency, and I was stupid enough to think I was rich in it." Sienna stayed quiet, letting the words settle. She wanted to tell him she understood. That betrayal doesn't just come from enemies. It comes from the people closest to you, the ones who know exactly where to cut the deepest. But she didn't say it. Instead, she asked the question that had been clawing at her since the moment he appeared on her screen. "So what now?" Alexander chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "I don't know." He rubbed his temples, his exhaustion finally catching up to him. "For the first time in years, I don't have a plan." Sienna's chest tightened. He was lost. And maybe that's why she didn't look away, because in some strange, twisted way, so was she. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Then, finally, Alexander met her gaze. "Why are you still here?" Sienna's breath hitched. She should have left, should have shut this down before it became something real. But she didn't. Instead, she held his stare, feeling something shift between them. something fragile, something dangerous. "Because," she whispered, "I think you need someone to be—" And for the first time since this conversation began, Alexander didn't have a comeback. The night stretched long and unforgiving, swallowing the city in cold silence. Sienna sat on the floor of her small apartment, knees pulled to her chest, the dim glow of her laptop screen the only source of light. She hadn't clicked out of the call yet, but neither had he. The silence between them was suffocating, filled with everything neither of them knew how to say. She should have left. She should have shut the laptop and buried herself in sleep, in forgetfulness. But instead she stayed, listening to the sound of his quiet breathing on the other end, watching as his figure remained slumped in the shadows of his extravagant penthouse. Two people, worlds apart, but drowning in the same darkness. Her fingers brushed against the old locket at her throat, the metal cool against her skin. She had spent so many years convincing herself she didn't need anyone, that she was better off alone. But now she wasn't sure. Her voice was barely a whisper. "What are you going to do?" Alexander exhaled, his breath heavy through the speakers. "I don't know." The words sent a strange ache through her chest. She had never heard him sound like this. He was always composed, always in control. But tonight, he was just a man who had lost too much. Sienna stared at the cracks in her ceiling, trying to ignore the tightening in her throat. "Maybe it's over," he murmured. Something inside her twisted. She knew what he meant. Not just the business, not just the empire he had built. Everything. Alexander sat motionless, his glass of whiskey untouched on the table beside him. The city lights outside his window were blurred, unfocused, like a world moving too fast while he stood still. He had spent years convincing himself that money meant security, that power meant control. And now? Now he had neither. He had poured his life into something that crumbled beneath him in a matter of hours. Everything he had worked for, stolen. His reputation, ruined. The people he had trusted, gone. And the worst part? He had no one to blame but himself. He clenched his fists, pressing them into his temples. His father's voice echoed in his head. "You're either the hunter or the prey, son. Never forget that." He had spent his entire life trying to prove he wasn't weak. But tonight, he felt like nothing. The silence in the penthouse was unbearable. He had never realized how empty it was until now. His phone sat on the table, screen cracked from where he had thrown it earlier. No calls, no messages. The people who used to beg for his time, for his money, for his approval, they had all disappeared. And now? Now he was just a man in a glass prison, staring at a city that no longer belonged to him. Sienna shut her laptop, but the silence remained. It filled the room like a ghost, pressing against her ribs, whispering in the spaces where hope used to live. She pulled her blanket tighter around herself, but it did nothing to chase away the cold. The kind of cold that wasn't just in the air, but in her bones, in her mind, in the life she had been trying so hard to survive. For years she had told herself she didn't need anything more, that she could survive on her own, that it was safer this way. And maybe it was. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of what she had lost. Her mother's laughter, the way it used to fill the kitchen on slow Sunday mornings, the warmth of knowing someone was waiting for her at the end of the day, the feeling of belonging to something, to someone. Sienna pressed her knuckles against her lips, willing herself not to cry. Crying was pointless. It didn't change anything. It didn't bring people back. It didn't stop the loneliness from creeping in like a slow-moving tide, rising higher and higher until she felt like she was drowning in it. She reached for her locket again, rubbing her thumb over the worn silver, a reminder of a promise never kept. "I'll come back for you, sweetheart." Her mother's voice echoed in her head, as vivid as if she had whispered it yesterday. But she never did. People always left. And maybe it was better to let Alexander go now, before she started believing he was different, because no one ever stayed. Alexander sat in the dark, fingers resting against the cool surface of the whiskey glass he hadn't touched. He could still hear her voice in his head, soft where unsure. asking if he had a plan. For the first time in years, he didn't. He had built his life around control, around power and strategy and knowing what came next. But now everything was gone. The company, his legacy, the empire he had sacrificed everything for. And in the silence of his penthouse, the truth hit him with brutal force. There was no one left. He had spent so much time keeping people at a distance, afraid that if he let them too close, they'd see the cracks beneath the surface. And maybe they would have. But now, staring at the empty glass in his hand, he wondered if it would have been better than this. A life built on numbers and contracts, on wealth and control, a life that had never actually belonged to him. Alexander exhaled sharply, pressing his fingers against his temples. He should let her go. It would be easier. But when he closed his eyes, all he saw was Sienna's face. And suddenly, he wasn't sure if he could. The city pulsed with life, oblivious to the storms brewing inside two lost souls. Sienna stood in front of her laptop, her hands clenched into fists. She had told herself she wouldn't do this, wouldn't let herself care, wouldn't let herself hope. But the image of Alexander, broken, defeated, lost, had been carved into her mind, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake it. He had lost everything, and maybe in some strange, twisted way, so had she. She exhaled sharply, pacing the small space of her apartment. What was she supposed to do? She had spent her entire life running, avoiding attachments, pushing people away before they could leave her first. But this was different, because for the first time in years, she wanted to stay. She turned back to the laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Would he even pick up? Would he want to see her? Or had she been fooling herself into thinking she mattered at all? Her heart pounded. She hesitated for a second longer, then clicked the call button. Alexander's penthouse was in ruins, not from damage, not from destruction, but from absence. The absence of people, of warmth, of anything that made a house feel like home. The once pristine space was just another reminder of everything he had lost. He sat on the couch, staring at his phone, his thoughts an unbearable mess of regrets and what-ifs. He should leave the city, start over, disappear. But where would he go? What was left? He was drowning in a silence he had built for himself. And then, his laptop screen flickered. A call. His chest tightened when he saw the name. Sienna. For a moment, he just stared at it. Why was she calling? She should have walked away by now. They always did. And yet, here she was. His fingers twitched over the keyboard before he made a decision. He picked up, the screen loaded, and there she was, eyes hesitant, lips slightly parted, the same guarded expression he had come to know. And yet beneath it, something else, something fragile, something real. She exhaled, shifting slightly in her seat. You look like hell. A breath of laughter escaped him. You're not wrong. Silence. Then quietly, why didn't you call me? Alexander swallowed, his grip tightening around the armrest. He didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did. Maybe he was afraid she would be just like the rest, temporary. Maybe he was afraid that if he reached out, if he let himself need her, she would leave too. So instead of answering, he asked the question that had been haunting him since the day they met. Why are you still here, Sienna? Her breath hitched, and for the first time she didn't run. Sienna didn't look away. She should have. It would have been easier, safer. But something about the way he asked, like he genuinely didn't believe anyone would choose to stay, made her chest ache in ways she didn't understand. She swallowed, her fingers gripping the frayed edge of her blanket. I don't know, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Alexander's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze searching hers. He wasn't buying it. Yes, you do. She exhaled sharply, turning away from the screen. Why did he have to push? She had spent so many years convincing herself she didn't need anyone, that letting people in only led to disappointment, to loss, to pain. But the truth was, She was tired. Tired of running. Tired of pretending she didn't care. Tired of lying to herself. Her throat tightened. "Because you look at me like I'm not invisible." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Silence. Sienna's heart pounded, her breath shaky. She had said too much. But when she forced herself to look at him, she didn't see mockery or pity. She saw understanding. Because Alexander knew that feeling too. The weight of being surrounded by people and still feeling alone. The exhaustion of wearing masks that never quite fit. The quiet, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, someone, someday, would see past all of it. His jaw clenched, and for the first time that night, he didn't have a clever response. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his voice quieter now. "And what if I told you I don't want you to be?" Sienna's breath caught. Because in that moment, he wasn't talking about just this call. He was talking about everything. Her hands trembled in her lap. This was too much. Too real. She had spent years keeping her world small, building walls high enough to keep anyone from getting too close. But now, sitting in this dimly lit room, staring at the only person who had ever made her feel like she mattered, she wondered if she had been wrong. Her mother had left. Everyone else had too. But what if this time was different? She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Then I wouldn't know what to do with that. A small, almost sad smile tugged at Alexander's lips. "Yeah," he murmured. "Me neither." But neither of them ended the call. And for the first time in a long time, the silence between them didn't feel empty. The weight of the moment pressed between them, stretching the silence into something neither of them dared to break. Sienna's pulse thundered in her ears. This was real. Too real. She wasn't supposed to let it get this far. She had spent her whole life preparing for people to leave, for connections to shatter before they had the chance to mean anything. But Alexander was still here, and that terrified her. She forced a breath into her lungs, her fingers trembling against the laptop keyboard. "What happens now?" she asked, barely recognizing her own voice. Alexander exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. He didn't have an answer. For the first time in years, he wasn't calculating his next move, wasn't thinking 3 steps ahead. He was just here, with her. And maybe for once, that was enough. "I don't know," he admitted, voice raw. "But I don't think I want to disappear." Something in her chest tightened. Neither did she. The realization sent a ripple of panic through her. She wasn't supposed to care. Because caring meant risk. Caring meant pain. Caring meant losing something she never should have wanted in the first place. But despite every instinct screaming at her to run, she stayed. The city outside Alexander's penthouse stretched endlessly into the horizon, the skyline sharp against the night sky. He stared out the window, phone still resting beside his laptop. She was still on the line. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. He had lost his empire, his wealth, his reputation. But none of it compared to the fear of losing the only thing that had ever felt real. Sienna. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling hard. "You're scared," he murmured, his voice softer now. Her breath hitched through the speakers. She didn't deny it. Neither did he. "I don't do this," she admitted finally. "I don't get close to people." Alexander's lips curled into a faint, tired smile. "Yeah, me neither." Silence. And then, "But maybe it's time we do." Sienna sucked in a sharp breath, the weight of his words settling deep into her bones. Her entire life had been built on the idea that attachment was a weakness, that loving people meant eventually losing them. But what if, for once, she was wrong? What if this time she wasn't meant to run? She closed her eyes, inhaling shakily. "Okay." The word was barely audible, but Alexander heard it. His chest tightened, a strange, unfamiliar warmth settling over him. For the first time since everything fell apart, he had something worth holding on to, and he wasn't going to let it go. The world outside had not changed, The city still pulsed with life, its streets humming with restless energy. People hurried from one place to another, cars weaved through traffic, and the neon signs flickered against the night sky. But Sienna had changed. She felt it in the quiet moments, in the way her body no longer tensed at the thought of tomorrow, in the way she no longer flinched when she let herself hope. She was still in her small apartment, still living in a world that had never made room for people like her, but for the first time she wasn't just waiting for the next disaster. She was looking forward. Her laptop sat open on her desk, but the screen was dark. Alexander had called earlier, just to check in. They didn't talk long. He was exhausted from another long day of reclaiming what had been stolen from him. But she could hear something in his voice now, something that hadn't been there before. A purpose. It was strange, knowing that they had both spent so much time drowning in their own silence, only to find that they had been the ones keeping themselves underwater all along. She glanced toward the small shelf above her desk, her fingers brushing over the worn edges of an old envelope. She had found it weeks ago, buried beneath a pile of forgotten things. Her mother's last letter. For years, she had refused to read it, refused to let herself reopen a wound that had never really healed. But tonight, she was ready. With careful hands, she unfolded the yellowed paper. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still there, waiting for her. My sweet girl, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I left you with nothing but questions and a hurt that no apology can erase. I wish I had been stronger, wish I had been the kind of mother you needed me to be. But I wasn't. I ran, the same way I always have, because that's all I've ever known how to do. Sienna's chest ached, the familiar pang of abandonment rising in her throat. But you are not me. You never were, and that is why you will make it, even without me. Because where I ran, you will stand. Where I broke, you will rebuild. A slow, shaky breath left her lips. She had spent so long believing that she was nothing more than the sum of what had been taken from her, that her mother's mistakes would always define her, that love was something temporary, fragile, doomed. But reading these words now, she realized something. Her mother had been wrong. Sienna hadn't survived because she was different. She had survived because she had chosen to. Because every day she had woken up and fought, even when it felt pointless. Because she had dared to keep going, even when everything told her she shouldn't. Her fingers curled around the paper, her breath slow and steady. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. The letter rested in Sienna's lap, the weight of its words pressing deep into her bones. For years, she had let these unspoken truths haunt her, let the absence of answers define her. But now? Now she was done carrying ghosts. A slow breath escaped her lips as she folded the letter carefully, her hands steady. She wasn't erasing the past. She was making peace with it. The city hummed outside her window, the distant glow of headlights painting soft patterns on the walls. The world had not stopped moving for her grief, had never slowed down for her pain, and now she wouldn't slow down for it either. Her laptop screen flickered back to life, and without hesitation, she clicked on her messages. Alexander's name sat at the top. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before typing. Sienna. Are you awake? The reply came almost instantly. Alexander. Aren't I always? She huffed a quiet laugh, shaking her head. Then, Sienna. I read the letter. No further explanation, no unnecessary words. And yet, somehow he understood. The typing bubbles appeared, disappeared, then reappeared. Then, Alexander. How do you feel? Sienna stared at the message for a long moment, letting the question settle deep in her chest. For years, the answer would have been angry, hurt, hollow. The night was still, the city humming softly in the background, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Sienna wasn't drowning in the silence. She had stayed. That realization sat heavy in her chest, both terrifying and strangely freeing. Alexander had lost everything, yet he hadn't disappeared. And neither had she. She sat on the edge of her bed, her laptop still open, his figure illuminated on the dim screen. He wasn't saying much, but he was there, just like she was. "I don't know what this means," she finally admitted. Alexander exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. "Neither do I." And yet, neither of them left. Maybe they didn't have to know. Maybe, for once, they could figure it out as they went. For Sienna, that was terrifying. But maybe, just maybe, terrifying wasn't always a bad thing. The days that followed weren't perfect. Sienna still struggled with the instinct to push him away, and Alexander wrestled with the weight of his downfall. But something had changed. They started talking more, about things that weren't just business or survival, things that mattered. Alexander told her about his childhood, about growing up in a family that saw love as a transaction, about the pressure to succeed at all costs. And in return, Sienna told him about her mother, about the empty promises, the slow unraveling of hope, the moment she realized she was truly alone. Their pain wasn't the same, but it mirrored in ways neither of them had expected, and it made them stay. One evening, as she sat curled up on her bed, her laptop open beside her, Alexander spoke into the quiet. "I think I'm going to fight for it." Sienna blinked. "For what?" His jaw tightened, determination flickering in his eyes. "Everything they took from me." She didn't respond immediately, not because she doubted him, but because she had never seen anyone fight for something the way he was willing to. She had always just accepted things, accepted that people left, that life was unfair, that some things weren't meant to be hers. But Alexander wasn't like that. He wasn't going to disappear, and maybe, just maybe, neither was she. Sienna stared at the screen, her breath slow and steady, but something deep inside her felt unsteady. Fight for it. She had never fought for anything. Not really. Life had always been about survival, about making it to the next day without letting the weight of the past crush her. But Alexander wasn't like her. He wasn't just surviving. He was reclaiming his empire, his name, his future. And for the first time, she wondered if she could do the same. Her fingers traced the locket at her throat, the cool metal grounding her. "Do you think it's worth it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander didn't hesitate. "Yes." She let out a shaky breath. "Even after everything?" His gaze was steady, unwavering. "Especially after everything." Something in her chest tightened. For so long she had believed that once something was broken, it was gone, that there was no point in piecing it back together because it would never be whole again. But what if she was wrong? What if broken things could still be rebuilt? Sienna exhaled softly, her fingers tightening around the locket. Maybe it was time she tried. Days turned into weeks. Alexander fought. He confronted the people who had betrayed him, exposed the corruption that had taken everything from him, and step by step, he began to rebuild. And Sienna? She started fighting too. She applied for jobs she never thought she was good enough for. She let herself imagine a future that wasn't just about survival. She let herself believe. She and Alexander still talked every night. The conversations weren't always deep. Sometimes they were just about stupid things, meaningless things. But the weight of them was never lost. They were both learning how to be more, not just the versions of themselves that had been shaped by pain, but something else, something freer, something real. One night, as the city buzzed outside her window, Sienna opened her laptop and hesitated before calling him. She never hesitated, but this time it felt different. Because this time, she wasn't calling to check if he was still there. She was calling because she wanted to be. The call connected, and there he was, tired but alive. The fight was taking its toll, but he was winning. And so was she. Sienna smiled softly. "You were right, you know." Alexander arched a brow. "About what?" Her fingers grazed the locket, a quiet acceptance settling over her. "That some things are worth fighting for." For a moment, Alexander just looked at her. Then he smiled. A real one. And this time, neither of them had to ask why the other was still here. They already knew. But tonight? Tonight, the answer was different. Sienna, lighter. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the kind that suffocated. It was the kind that understood. Finally. Alexander. That's good. It was. It really was. The next morning, the sky was softer, as if the universe itself had exhaled. Sienna stepped outside, her hands stuffed into her jacket pockets, the cool morning air brushing against her skin. For the first time in years, she wasn't running late. She wasn't running at all. A job interview waited for her downtown, a real opportunity. One she had almost talked herself out of, convinced that she wasn't good enough. But now she wasn't letting fear decide for her. She walked with purpose, her footsteps steady against the pavement. Halfway there, her phone vibrated. Alexander. Did you leave yet? She smirked, shaking her head. Sienna. Walking there now. Try not to be too proud of me. Alexander. Too late. A warmth bloomed in her chest, unexpected but welcome. She pocketed her phone, stepping onto the crosswalk. This was new. Letting herself believe in something good, letting herself hold on to it. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready,